The story begins on a wall covered from edge to edge with photographs, notes, and evidence tied to every person who has ever crossed paths with the Punisher. This is the private record of a man who has spent his entire existence punishing the cruel, the corrupt, and the unforgivable. Several faces on the wall have been marked with a harsh X, carved right through them like a final verdict. Those marks mean the targets are gone for good. To Frank Castle, each crossed-out face represents another mission finished, another monster removed from the world, and another violent chapter closed. But now, that wall also represents something far more troubling. It is a checklist written in pain, vengeance, and blood, and for the first time in a long while it looks complete. Soon after, Frank Castle steps into frame. He is our central figure, carrying the kind of brutal presence that makes him one of the most feared anti-heroes in this universe. Frank is not the type of man who believes justice comes from courtrooms, paperwork, or prison sentences. In his eyes, the system is too slow, too weak, and too willing to let evil breathe another day. His belief is much darker and much simpler. A criminal who is no longer alive can never hurt anyone again. To keep up with the most vicious people the city can produce, Frank forces himself to remain in terrifying physical condition. He spends countless hours training, pushing through pain until his fists split open and his muscles are ready to give out. For him, exercise is not about health, vanity, or discipline in the normal sense. It is preparation. And there is no stronger fuel than staring at a wall filled with the faces of killers, predators, and scum whose choices brought them straight to his doorstep. These were people who earned their endings, and Frank made sure they reached them. After another punishing workout, powered by a strange mix of energy drinks and whiskey, Frank tries to return to his usual routine. But there is one problem. There are no obvious targets left. With no fresh criminals to chase and no mission to focus on, his anger starts eating him alive. The emptiness becomes unbearable. Eventually, that frustration explodes, and Frank tears down the wall of trophies in a violent outburst, desperate for new names, new faces, and a reason to keep going. That is when the focus shifts to the city outside, which has completely fallen apart. The streets are boiling over with chaos. Riots have erupted across the neighborhoods, and the people are furious over the crime wave swallowing their communities. Law enforcement has failed so badly that regular citizens no longer believe anyone is coming to protect them. In that power vacuum, young people have started stepping into the streets, convinced they need to handle justice on their own. But as always, movements with good intentions attract people who only want destruction. Among the angry crowds are criminals using the unrest as cover to smash windows, rob small businesses, attack the vulnerable, and twist a call for peace and justice into another excuse for violence. Across radio and television broadcasts, frightened residents who are too scared to leave their homes beg for some kind of savior. They need someone, anyone, capable of stopping the madness before the entire city burns itself down. Everywhere you look, people are turning on each other. The city has become a nightmare with concrete walls and flashing police lights. Whatever fragile balance once existed has completely collapsed. The old mobs that used to control certain neighborhoods and keep a tense version of order in exchange for monthly payments are now locked in open war with rival gangs. Their fight for territory has turned ordinary streets into battle zones, leaving innocent people, workers, families, and bystanders trapped between bullets and brutality. That morning, the story follows a homeless man named Eddie. He has managed to gather just enough food to share with his loyal dog, Camo, the one companion who still means everything to him. Eddie is only looking for a quiet corner where the two of them can sit down and eat without being bothered. But before he gets that chance, a group of vicious young punks spots him and decides he is their next source of entertainment. They attack him for no reason, kicking him directly in the face while he is simply trying to feed his dog. Even worse, they record the whole thing, live streaming their cruelty for attention. To them, Eddie's suffering is content. It is senseless, ugly, and empty. But the most horrifying part comes when they take Camo. The leader of the group holds the dog and pretends to be gentle, stroking him with fake kindness while something much darker begins showing behind his eyes. Eddie panics immediately. He screams, begs, and pleads with them not to hurt the only friend he has in the world. His voice cracks as he tries to reach whatever bit of humanity might still exist inside them. Then a garbage truck turns the corner. In Camo's final moments, the dog is still being touched with false affection by the same boy who is about to murder him. The second the opportunity appears, the thug throws the helpless animal beneath the massive wheels of the truck. Eddie's scream tears through the street, loud enough to echo for blocks. His best friend is gone, killed for a few seconds of sick amusement by people with no empathy and no soul. What makes it even more unbearable is the reaction of everyone nearby. The people walking past see what happened, but none of them step in. No one comforts Eddie. No one confronts the attackers. They simply look away, keep moving, and make sure the problem does not become theirs. The city has rotted into a brutal urban wilderness, where survival comes first and basic human decency has almost disappeared. Nobody stops to think. Nobody wants to get involved. Everyone has learned to protect themselves by pretending not to see. From there, the story returns to Frank, sitting alone in the center of a room while the weight of his past presses down on him. He is surrounded by memories of the soldiers, friends, and brothers-in-arms he has lost along the way. As he sits there, he begins recalling pieces of the trauma that came with the violent road he chose. The ghosts of his past do not leave him in peace. They linger around him, judging him, reminding him, and dragging him back into old wounds. Frank repeats the Marine Corps mantra again and again, almost like a prayer, clinging to it while the memories of his former squad close in around him. After several tense moments, he takes a blade and carves an X across the tattoo that once represented his identity as a man who served his country. That symbol used to mean purpose, loyalty, and belonging. Now, Frank feels like he has been stripped of all of it. Among the figures haunting him, the ghost of Curtis stands apart from the rest. Curtis is not there to torment him or bury him under guilt. He is the gentler voice, the one presence that still seems to care whether Frank is surviving or falling apart. Instead of attacking him, Curtis checks on him, asking how he is really doing and trying to offer him at least one piece of advice that might help him hold himself together. Not long after, Frank takes out a suitcase and begins filling it with weapons. At first, it seems like he is preparing to return to war, ready to unleash himself on the city once again. But that is not what he does. Instead, he carries the arsenal away and locks it inside a secure storage locker, hiding the tools of his old life where they cannot easily reach him. With his weapons stashed and his past still breathing down his neck, Frank leaves his home and walks out into the streets. What waits for him outside is a city drowning in fear, rage, and violence, with chaos spreading in every direction. Around the same time, the story takes us to a small coffee shop nearby, run by a hard-working man named Dre. Every morning, Dre shows up, opens the place, and pushes through the grind for one reason above all else: his little daughter, Charlie. Everything he does, every long shift and every difficult customer, is for her future. On this particular day, the usual routine is interrupted when a wild-eyed man, clearly under the influence of something heavy, stumbles into the shop and demands coffee. Dre has dealt with enough unstable people to know that reacting with anger only makes things worse. So instead of escalating, he keeps his voice steady and tells the man to wait his turn. If he gets in line like everyone else, Dre says, he will get his coffee. Just then, the television in the shop cuts to a breaking news report. The broadcast reveals that the Nucci crime family has been wiped out completely. With their organization destroyed, the only groups left behind are scattered, low-level gangs and small crews now fighting each other for control of the neighborhood. A moment later, the story makes Frank's guilt much clearer. He was the one responsible for destroying the Nucci family. And now, watching the city collapse into open violence, he cannot escape the feeling that this chaos is partly his fault. The Nuccis were criminals, no question about it. They extorted people, controlled blocks through fear, and profited off everyone around them. But in their own brutal way, they'd kept a certain kind of order. Once Frank removed them from the equation, that ugly balance broke apart. Seconds after this realization settles in, Frank enters Dre's coffee shop. Without making a scene, he takes the cup of coffee that was meant for the drugged-out man and walks right back outside. For a brief moment, he tries to drink it in silence, as if that small pause might give him even a few seconds of peace. As he leaves, he hears the unstable man still rambling inside the shop, muttering about monsters coming after him and claiming they are hiding in the walls. And outside, the city continues to prove that maybe the man's fear is not as far from reality as it sounds. In the background, the same group of punks who murdered Camo are seen attacking another man, beating him down and stealing everything he has. The police, as usual, do nothing. Nearby, the very officer who had earlier tried to run from the riot is now trapped on a street corner, getting savagely beaten by a mob of thugs while his patrol car burns behind him. Through all of it, Frank keeps moving. The destruction, the screaming, the violence, the suffering, none of it seems to pull him in. He walks through the ruined streets like a ghost passing through someone else's nightmare. After several minutes, an expensive car glides dangerously close to him and slows down just as it reaches his side. Frank catches it instantly. Years of survival have trained him to notice danger before it announces itself, and he understands right away that he needs to stay alert. Eventually, Frank arrives at the cemetery. This is where his wife and daughter are buried, and it is the one place where his armor begins to crack. He leaves the key to the locker containing his hidden weapons at their grave, almost like he is surrendering the last piece of the man he used to be. Then he takes a quiet moment to speak to them. Frank asks his wife if she is still with him, still close enough to hear him, or if he has drifted too far from her. He once promised he would never quit, never abandon her, and never leave her behind. But standing there among the graves, he knows he has already broken that promise in ways he can barely face. The guilt crushes him. He admits that he is tired, not just physically tired, but tired in his soul. He wants the fight to end. He wants to stop hurting. More than anything, he wants to be with them again. With tears in his eyes, Frank takes a gun from his pocket and presses the barrel against his head. As he stands there on the edge of ending everything, memories begin to flood his mind. He sees his daughter standing on the stairs, waving to him with the kind of innocence that still cuts through him after all these years. It is one of the few beautiful images he can still hold on to clearly. Then he remembers his son in the swimming pool, laughing and calling out for him to come join them. For a second, the memories feel warm. Then they twist into horror. Blood begins to pour from his wife and children, turning those precious fragments of happiness into visions of the nightmare that stole them from him. The pain crashes over Frank all at once, brutal and overwhelming, like the past has finally found a way to bury him alive. Frank snaps his eyes open, and suddenly, the image of his daughter is standing right there in front of him. This time, she looks different from the broken visions in his mind. She seems peaceful, almost angelic, glowing with a quiet love that does not need words. She does not speak to him, but she does not have to. Her presence alone is enough. Frank drops the gun in shock. In that instant, he understands that this is not how his story is supposed to end. Still, the moment disappears almost as quickly as it came, leaving him shaken, furious, and heartbroken by how little time he was given with her. On his way back home, Frank notices the luxury car again. It is still following him. He cuts through a deserted alley, and as he moves deeper into the empty passage, a sudden vision flashes before him. He sees himself wearing the Punisher suit, the symbol of the violent identity he has been trying to leave behind. Before he can reach his apartment building, a woman in a wheelchair appears and greets him. Frank looks around and immediately realizes something is wrong. Men on motorcycles have positioned themselves all around him. The alley has become a cage, and he has walked straight into it. There is no mistaking it now. This is a setup. The woman begins to speak, telling Frank about the nightmare that destroyed her family. She says every person she loved was erased from the world with ruthless cruelty. Her husband, Benny, was the first to die. She remembers how he came home the night before his death, smelling like cigarettes and cheap perfume from another woman. By then, she says, she had long stopped expecting faithfulness from him. But betrayal or not, he was still her husband. Losing him still tore something out of her. Her son Bobby was next. He had gone out with his wife when someone butchered him, slashing his throat with an axe. Then came her second son, Eddie. He was gunned down outside a club, shredded by machine gun fire in the street. The only mercy in that moment was that his children had already gone inside, which spared them from being caught in the attack. The final loss was Carlo, her youngest and most beloved son, her prince, her favorite. The last clear thing she remembers from the hit that took him is the time glowing on the car clock, 6047. Those three numbers burn themselves into her mind. Since that day, she has repeated them endlessly, like a punishment she is forced to carry every waking second. As the old woman describes each death, Frank's expression changes. He does not need her to explain who they were. He remembers all of them. He remembers every killing, every face, every moment. because he was the one who carried out the executions. She is talking about the Nucci family. The same family Frank Castle hunted down and slaughtered during his bloody campaign for revenge. The woman standing in front of Frank is the surviving matriarch of the mob family he destroyed. She is now trapped in a wheelchair, surrounded by a few hired tough guys who look like they would betray her instantly if someone offered them even slightly better money. Once she finishes recounting the deaths of her family, she forces herself upright with the help of her crutches. Her body may be weak, but her hatred is sharp enough to cut through the entire alley. With pure poison in her voice, she tells Frank that he is nothing more than a starving animal, a creature built for bloodshed that never knows when to stop. She screams that he stole every person she ever loved, and yet somehow he still gets to stand there alive, breathing, waiting for a death she believes he has not earned. To her, the life Frank is left with is its own punishment, an endless stretch of isolation, guilt, and misery. Then she brings up Carlo, the son she loved most. The last memory she has of him is Carlo telling her he loved her right before Frank ended his life by crushing his skull beneath his boot. That image has lived inside her every day since, and now she has finally arranged her answer. Her revenge is not going to be simple. It is going to be public, chaotic, and cruel. At exactly 6047 that afternoon, the same time burned into her memory from the moment she lost her son, a massive bounty will be placed on Frank Castle. Even worse, his exact location will be released to anyone willing to come after him. At the very minute she once said goodbye to Carlo, Frank will either have to run for his life or stand still and let the city tear him apart in the most agonizing way possible. She wants him to understand one thing clearly. He did not end anything when he slaughtered her family. He only changed the shape of the punishment. Now she sees herself as the one delivering judgment, and Frank is the target marked for execution. With a satisfied smirk, the old woman rolls away, telling him that watching him die will be one of the greatest pleasures she has left. Only moments later, Frank, who had spent so much time drifting through his days like a man already half gone, is suddenly alert again. His eyes scan every corner, every shadow, every possible line of attack. The hunter in him is waking up. When he returns to his apartment, another vision hits him. This time, Karen appears, screaming that he has failed. Everyone, his family, his friends, in the entire city. Her words dig straight into the wounds Frank has been trying to ignore. But then she sees just how broken he really is, and her tone shifts. Instead of only blaming him, she reminds him that his work is not finished. The Punisher is not done yet. Karen guides him through the apartment, leading him toward the drawer where his weapons are hidden. Then the danger becomes immediate. Through the peephole in his apartment door, Frank sees the hallway filling with masked men. They are carrying bats, pipes, blades, and anything else they can use to beat him to death and claim the price on his head. The clock is ticking. Technically, no one can collect the bounty until 6047, but that does not matter. Plenty of people hate Frank Castle enough to kill him for free. As Frank watches from behind the door, the attackers move toward his neighbor's apartment. One of them starts hacking into the door with a machete. Inside lives a defenseless woman and her young son Isaiah, the same boy who always greeted Frank whenever he passed through the building. Now Frank has a choice. He can remain hidden and maybe buy himself another hour of life, or he can step out and help them before the mother and child become two more victims in a city already drowning in them. Their screams tear through the building. Then something begins spreading beneath Frank's door, sliding across the floor like a dark warning. Before he can fully process what it is, flames explode across the hallway. It is gasoline. The men outside are willing to burn down the entire floor if that is what it takes to flush Frank out. In seconds, fire wraps around his feet, and there is no more time to think. He can either drop and roll away from the flames, or he can do what he has always done best. With classical music rising over the chaos, Frank charges. He slams through the apartment door with raw force, splintering it apart as he bursts into the burning hallway. Knife in hand, he cuts into the mob of attackers like a one-man war machine. There is no hesitation, no mercy, and no wasted movement. He drops man after man, carving through half a dozen of them before they can even understand what they have unleashed. Frank pushes into the neighbor's apartment with cold, brutal precision. Step by step, he moves through the rooms, driving his blade into chests, arms, throats, and anywhere else that ends the fight fast. By the time he finishes, none of the men who broke in are left standing. The instant he creates an opening, Frank orders Isaiah and his mother to run. But the fight is far from over. A new attacker named Sebi storms in with a baseball bat and catches Frank hard in the ribs. He follows it with a few more heavy shots, trying to put Frank down before he can recover. But Frank absorbs the pain, regains his footing almost instantly, and fires back with terrifying force. He lands a perfectly placed strike that crushes Sebi's skull, then moves just in time to avoid an axe swing from another man trying to blindside him. For a brief second, it seems like Frank has survived the ambush. Then a gunshot cracks through the hallway. A man drops dead just outside, and within moments, more armed attackers flood into the apartment. One of them carries a shotgun and starts blasting through the rooms without restraint, tearing the place apart in a desperate attempt to kill Frank. Frank reacts on instinct. He grabs one of the henchmen and uses him as a human shield, absorbing the incoming fire long enough to protect himself. At the same time, he strips the man of his weapon and turns the fight into a close-quarters gun battle inside the apartment. From there, Frank's training takes over completely. He moves from cover to cover, picking off the attackers one by one with ruthless accuracy. When the shotgun runs empty, he switches to a sawed-off weapon that enters the fight at just the right moment. The apartment turns into a massacre as Frank fires at point-blank range, blasting through anyone who comes near him, no matter what they are carrying or how many of them there are. The skirmish finally ends when one of the attackers fails to throw a grenade properly. The mistake costs them everything. The explosion rips through the area, bringing the fight to a violent stop. For a moment, Frank catches his breath and looks out the window. That is when he realizes the situation is much worse than one hallway ambush. The entire building is under attack. People are being dragged from their apartments, beaten in the open, and thrown from balconies into the darkness below. The bounty has not just put Frank in danger, it has turned everyone around him into collateral damage. The mercenaries know Frank is somewhere inside the building, but they do not know which apartment belongs to him. So instead of searching carefully, they choose the cruelest method possible. They turn the entire place into a war zone, attacking residents at random and creating enough terror to force Frank out of hiding. Before another innocent person can be killed, Frank uses the final round in his shotgun to intervene. From above, he lines up the shot and drops the thug threatening them, taking him out from a higher floor with cold precision. Then Frank moves fast, dropping to the lower level so he can grab the dead man's weapon and keep the fight going. From that moment on, he begins carving a path through the building. Every mercenary unlucky enough to cross his line of sight catches a bullet. Each shot is not just an attack, it is a rescue. Every time Frank pulls the trigger, someone who was seconds away from being beaten, stabbed, or thrown to their death gets another chance to live. The criminals chasing him do not even care if they kill each other in the process. As long as Frank dies, the rest is just noise. After all, only one person can collect the bounty, and men like these do not understand loyalty. They are thieves, killers, and opportunists, all willing to betray each other the moment it gives them an advantage. Frank's biggest problem is ammunition. There is no room to pause, reload properly, or catch his breath, so every body that hits the floor becomes a supply drop. When one weapon runs empty, he takes another from the next dead attacker and keeps moving. Using a powerful rifle, Frank spots a young girl about to be hurled from one of the upper floors. With only a moment to react, he steadies himself and lands a perfect long-distance headshot, killing the thug before the girl can be thrown over the edge. But that single moment of focus almost costs him his life. 4 men come rushing out of an elevator nearby, nearly catching him off guard. Frank barely recovers in time, but once he does, the outcome is the same. He drops them and keeps pushing forward. He understands he cannot survive this kind of fight forever. The longer he stays inside, the more attackers will flood the building. So Frank starts moving downward, trying to reach the lower floors and escape onto the street. But when he enters the stairwell, he walks straight into another ambush. A wave of men closes in on him, and he is forced to burn through a huge amount of ammunition just to keep a machete from splitting him open. That is when Frank realizes the street is no longer an option. There are too many enemies below, and trying to force his way out would only get him trapped. So he changes direction. Frank starts climbing back up, killing everyone coming down the stairs until he finally reaches the roof. The second he gets there, he smashes the lock on the door and jams it shut behind him, buying himself a few precious minutes before the mob can break through. But the roof is not the safe ground he hoped for. The problem is simple. There is more than one way up. Before Frank can properly position himself, dozens of attackers surge onto the rooftop from both stairwells. They swarm him from multiple angles, and his ammunition begins running dangerously low. During one desperate move, the fight slips out of his control for just a second, and a bullet tears into his shoulder. Frank is forced behind cover, wounded and breathing hard, trying to figure out how to survive the next wave. But the attackers do not slow down. They keep coming with katanas, axes, blades, and whatever weapons they manage to bring with them. Every single one of them wants the glory of being the person who finally kills the Punisher. They rush him recklessly, driven by greed, hatred, and the promise of money. Frank answers with pure survival instinct. Even injured, he fights like a man who refuses to be buried. He turns their own weapons against them, cutting, striking, and shooting his way through the crowd until the rooftop is littered with bodies. One by one, the men who came to claim the bounty realize they were never hunting easy prey. Finally, only one attacker remains. The man manages to tackle Frank and drive him backward, sending him over the edge of the roof. As Frank falls, he still manages to aim and fire midair. The shot lands clean, punching through the man's skull before Frank crashes down onto an air conditioning unit below. The impact is brutal. His back takes the full force of the fall, and for a moment the pain nearly shuts his body down. But Frank keeps moving. He has survived far worse than a fall from a couple of stories, and he is not about to let this be the thing that kills him. Still, the situation below is no better. The street is packed with enemies, and standing right in the middle of the chaos is the old woman, waiting for the moment she finally gets to see Frank die. Seconds later, more thugs reach the rooftop above him. With nowhere else to go, Frank throws himself toward a section of wooden scaffolding on the side of the building. The landing is vicious, rattling his body with another wave of pain, but he manages to catch himself partway down. One gang leader, eager to keep the chase alive, shoves one of his own men off the roof after him, but the move is reckless and poorly aimed. The young thug misses Frank completely and slams into the ground, dying instantly. After another rough descent and a hard crash onto the pavement, Frank finally reaches the street. His first instinct is to go straight for the old woman. She is the source of the bounty, the one who turned the entire city against him, and ending her could stop this nightmare. But before he can reach her, men who recognize his face keep lunging at him from every direction. Frank is forced to slow down, fighting them off one after another as the chance to get to her starts slipping away. Then he sees something that changes everything. Dre's coffee shop is under attack. The same hardworking man who had treated him with basic kindness, the father who spends every day trying to build a better life for his little girl, is now in danger. Thugs are storming the shop, preparing to burn it down and take Charlie. Frank is forced into a choice. On one side, he has a clear shot at revenge. He can go after the old woman who put the bounty on his head and made him the target of every killer in the city. On the other, he can save an honest man and the daughter he has sacrificed everything to protect. And in that moment, Frank has to decide what kind of punishment truly matters. For Frank, the decision seems obvious at first. He keeps moving toward the old woman. Every part of him wants to reach her, grab her by the throat, and squeeze until the hatred finally disappears from her eyes. She is the one who lit the fuse. She is the one who turned the city into a hunting ground. And for a brief moment, Frank is completely ready to make her pay for it. But then he hears Charlie. Her terrified voice cuts through the chaos as she cries out for help. Inside the coffee shop, Dre is pinned down, helpless, while one of the attackers beats him with a baseball bat. Then Charlie screams one word that freezes Frank in place. "Daddy!" The sound hits him harder than any bullet or blade. It reminds him too much of his own daughter, of the family he lost, and of the promise he almost forgot he was still carrying. In that instant, revenge loses its grip on him. Frank turns away from the old woman and sprints toward the coffee shop. The old mob matriarch escapes in her car, staring back at him with venom in her eyes. She is certain of one thing: Frank Castle will not survive the night. On his way to Dre's shop, Frank intercepts one of the bikers working for her. He knocks the man off his motorcycle and takes his gun without slowing down. With the weapon in hand, he charges into the fight and quickly drops the 4 thugs beating Dre. Then Frank storms inside the coffee shop. Anyone holding a weapon becomes a target. He moves through the place with ruthless speed, eliminating every armed attacker between him and the family. One of the men has his throat cut, his blood spilling across the fresh donuts Dre had baked that morning. Another tries to stand against Frank, only to have his face scalded and smashed with a pot of boiling coffee turned into a weapon. Before Frank can even confirm that Charlie and Dre are safe, something even worse crashes into the shop. A massive Russian attacker bursts through the chaos, shirtless, tattooed, and carrying a knife. He drives the blade straight into Frank's shoulder, carving open a deep, brutal wound. The giant presses the advantage immediately, charging at Frank with overwhelming strength and twisting the knife inside the injury to make the pain as unbearable as possible. But pain has never been enough to stop Frank Castle. The Punisher grabs a pen and slams it into the man's ribs. Then he keeps going. He strikes again and again, stabbing into the giant's neck, face, and arms with savage determination until the attacker finally collapses. The huge man falls choking on his own blood, defeated by a wounded Frank who refuses to stay down. The fight leaves the shop looking like a nightmare. Frank, bleeding badly and barely holding himself together, yanks the knife out of his own shoulder and starts limping toward the exit. But before he can disappear, Charlie runs to him and wraps her arms around him. She thanks him for saving her and her father. Dra, bruised and struggling just to stand upright, pulls his daughter close and looks at Frank with genuine gratitude. In the middle of all the blood, broken glass, and destruction, this small moment of kindness somehow feels louder than the sirens outside. Then Charlie asks Frank to wait. She hands him a rose she made herself, offering it with a gentle, innocent smile. For one brief second, that smile reaches a part of Frank that the world has almost completely buried. The city's most dangerous man softens, if only for a moment. As sirens grow louder in the distance, Frank steps back onto the street. The violence has not stopped. People are still looting stores, businesses are being torn apart, and bodies are scattered across the neighborhood. Soon after, the police finally arrive in force. Cruisers pull up, officers begin taping off the area, and ambulances rush in to treat the wounded. Frank does not stay. He keeps walking until he reaches the cemetery again. At his family's grave, he clears away the trash that has gathered around the headstones, restoring a little dignity to the place where his heart is buried. Then he places Charlie's handmade rose on his daughter's grave. Standing there, Frank thanks his daughter for being with him when he needed her most. A moment later, he notices something he had left behind earlier. The key to the locker containing his weapons and uniform is still there at the grave. Frank picks it up, the meaning settling over him. Maybe he is not finished after all. Maybe the only way forward is to keep walking until there is one final punishment left to deliver. In the next scene, we return to the cruel young punk who killed Camo. He is still roaming the streets freely, now raising a bat toward a defenseless old woman as if he has learned nothing and fears no consequence. That is when Frank appears, or rather, the Punisher does. He strikes the kid with a kick so powerful it sends him crashing into a pole. The boy collapses in terror as Frank closes in and presses a knife near his eye. Just as Frank is about to end him, Eddie appears and begs him not to get blood on his cap. The punk, now trembling and exposed for the coward he always was, quickly hands the cap back without any resistance. But then Eddie tells Frank exactly what this kid did to Camo. The moment Frank hears the truth, the boy tries to run. He does not get far. Frank spins and hurls an axe into his back, stopping him before he can escape the consequences of what he did. The special ends on a striking image of Frank Castle fully returned to his identity. He stands in tactical gear, the iconic skull burning across his chest like a warning to every predator left in the city. As the heartless punk lies wounded on the ground, Frank raises his weapon with cold certainty. Then he fires a single shot into the face of the man who tortured and killed an innocent dog for amusement. With that final act of brutal justice, the screen fades to black. The message is unmistakable. The Punisher is back, and in a city drowning in chaos, he has returned to drag order out of the blood and fire. One thing I appreciated right away about the Punisher, One Last Kill, is that it doesn't waste much time pretending Frank Castle is in a good place. The moment this story begins, you can feel that something is off. Not in a dramatic, world-ending Marvel kind of way. It's smaller than that. Messier. Frank is basically existing rather than living. He's hiding out in Little Sicily, a neighborhood that's fallen apart so badly it barely feels connected to the rest of the city anymore. The place has this exhausted atmosphere hanging over it. People aren't thriving, they're surviving. Criminals are filling every gap they can find, and nobody really seems capable of stopping them. It feels less like a battleground and more like a wound that's been left untreated for too long. And honestly, that's probably why Frank fits into it so naturally. What's interesting is that this isn't a story about him hunting somebody down from the start. For once, he's not the one kicking the door open, he's the target. The violence comes looking for him. The reason for that is Magnucci, who enters the story carrying her own anger, her own grief, and a very long list of reasons to hate Frank Castle. Rather than going after him herself, she turns him into a prize. Suddenly, there's a bounty attached to his name, and that changes the entire dynamic of the special. Everybody wants a piece of him. Mercenaries, gang members, opportunists, people looking for money, people looking for reputation, people who probably don't even know why they're hunting him in the first place. They just know there's a reward waiting at the end. What I liked about this setup is how simple it is. There's no complicated conspiracy board, no endless exposition dump, no mystery box that's clearly being saved for another Disney Plus season. The premise is almost brutally straightforward. Frank Castle is trapped in a neighborhood that's already descending into chaos, and now every violent person in that neighborhood has a reason to come through his door. That's really it. But sometimes that's enough. Because underneath all of that, there's something else going on. The bounty isn't just creating a physical threat, it's forcing Frank into a situation he clearly doesn't want. Every step of this story feels like he's being dragged back towards something he was trying, unsuccessfully, to leave behind. And that's where the special starts finding its identity. On the surface, it's a siege story, a survival story, a man trapped while enemies close in from every direction. Underneath, though, it feels more like a collision between Frank's past and whatever future he thought he might still have left. Whether he wants that fight or not doesn't really matter. The neighborhood is already falling apart. The hunters are already coming. And Frank Castle, as usual, is standing right in the middle of it. What really surprised me about One Last Kill isn't the violence. I mean, it's the Punisher. Violence is kind of the entry fee. What caught me off guard was just how broken Frank Castle feels when we first find him. Not angry. Not focused, not even particularly dangerous, at least not in the way we're used to seeing him, just tired. And I don't mean the action movie version of tired where a character says they're done and then immediately starts throwing people through windows 5 minutes later. I mean genuinely exhausted. The kind of exhaustion that settles into somebody after carrying the same weight for years and realizing it never actually got lighter. That's where Frank is when this story begins. One thing that's always been interesting about this version of the character is that the revenge story is technically over. The people responsible for destroying his family have been hunted down. The mission that defined his entire existence has already happened. So what's left? That's the question hanging over almost every early scene. Because for Frank, revenge wasn't just revenge. It became structure. It became routine. It became identity. And once that's gone, he's left staring at something he doesn't seem equipped to deal with, himself. There are several moments throughout the opening stretch where you get the sense that he's running out of reasons to keep moving forward. The special spends more time sitting with that idea than I expected. Some viewers are probably going to love that. Others are probably going to wish it got to the action faster. Honestly, I can understand both reactions. But I found those scenes important because they establish something that often gets overlooked with The Punisher. The guy isn't okay, not remotely. Sometimes comic book adaptations have a tendency to romanticize damaged characters. They turn trauma into cool dialogue and emotional scars into personality traits. This special doesn't really do that. Frank's grief feels ugly. It feels heavy. It feels like something that's actively consuming him. There were moments where he seemed less like a man planning his next move and more like somebody drifting through the wreckage of his own life. And that's what makes the early sections uncomfortable in a way I actually appreciated. Because the film isn't asking whether Frank can beat another army of criminals. We already know he can. The real question is whether he has anything left outside of that violence. Can he exist without a target? Can he function without a mission? Can Frank Castle be Frank Castle if he's not the Punisher? The special keeps circling that idea over and over again, and honestly, I think that's why the opening works as well as it does. Before the bullets start flying and before the body count starts climbing, we're looking at a man who has reached the point where even revenge isn't enough anymore. There's a sadness to that, not the kind that's trying to force an emotional reaction out of you. It's quieter than that. It's seeing someone achieve the thing they've dedicated their entire life to and realizing it didn't fix anything. If anything, it left an even bigger hole behind. And whether you end up loving the special or not, I think that part is hard to ignore. Because underneath all the action, all the gunfire, all the brutality that comes later, One Last Kill starts with a man who's completely lost. Not physically, emotionally. And for Frank Castle, that might actually be worse. The thing that kept sticking in my head while watching this special is that Frank Castle isn't really treated like a superhero here. Honestly, I don't even think the movie wants you to see him that way, and that's important. Because somewhere along the way, especially online, the Punisher has developed this weird reputation where people focus almost entirely on the violence, the guns, the body count, the intimidation factor. The image of Frank Castle standing in a hallway surrounded by defeated enemies. That's the version people put on posters. But when you actually sit down and watch One Last Kill, that's not really the guy we're looking at. What we're seeing is somebody who has completely lost the ability to separate himself from his pain, and that's a lot less glamorous. One of the reasons I think Jon Berntha's version works so well is that he never plays Frank like some untouchable action icon. Even in scenes where he's clearly the most dangerous person in the room, there's always something broken underneath it. You can feel it. Sometimes it's in the way he speaks. Sometimes it's in the way he doesn't speak. The silence tells you just as much as the dialogue does. Because the deeper this special gets into Frank's head, the more you start realizing that being the Punisher isn't some empowering transformation anymore. It's not Bruce Wayne becoming Batman. It's not Peter Parker putting on a mask. It's closer to an addiction, or maybe a prison. The strange thing is that Frank seems to understand that too. There are moments throughout the special where you get the sense that he knows exactly what this life has done to him. He knows what happens every time he picks up a weapon. He knows where the road leads. He just doesn't know how to walk away from it. That's where the tragedy comes from. Not the deaths, not the trauma, not even the violence. It's the realization that Frank Castle may have reached a point where he genuinely cannot imagine himself as anything else. Think about it. The revenge mission that defined his life has already happened. The people responsible are gone. Most stories would treat that as the ending. For Frank, it feels like a problem. Because if revenge was the purpose, what happens after the purpose disappears? The special keeps quietly wrestling with that idea without ever spelling it out directly. And I actually appreciated that. A lot of modern movies have a habit of explaining every emotional beat to the audience. Here, some of the strongest moments come from simply watching Frank exist in empty spaces. Sitting alone, walking through neighborhoods that feel abandoned, looking like a man who's carrying a conversation in his head that nobody else can hear. It's uncomfortable at times. Honestly, it should be. Because this isn't a story about healing, at least not really. If anything, it's a story about somebody discovering that healing might no longer be available to them. And that's why I found the character surprisingly sad throughout the entire special, not because I felt sorry for him. There's a difference. I felt sad because every time it looks like Frank might find another path, something pulls him right back into the same cycle he's been trapped in for years. Sometimes it's external circumstances. Sometimes it's his own nature. Most likely, it's both. Either way, the result is the same. He keeps moving forward, but he never really moves on. And by the time the action finally takes over, there's this lingering feeling that you're not watching a man win a battle. You're watching a man return to the only thing he knows how to do. That's a much darker idea than most superhero stories are willing to explore. Maybe that's why this version of Frank Castle continues to resonate with so many people. Not because he's invincible, not because he's cool. Because underneath all the violence, he's a tragedy that never quite reaches its ending. Now, this is probably where the movie becomes the most divisive. Because while I was watching One Last Kill, there was one thought that kept creeping into the back of my mind. Haven't we kind of been here before? And to be fair, that's not a criticism aimed specifically at this special. It's something that's followed this version of the Punisher for years now. Every time Frank Castle shows up, it feels like we find him standing at the exact same crossroads. He's done being the Punisher. He's tired. He's trying to walk away. He's questioning everything. Then something happens. Violence returns to his life, and by the end, he's the Punisher again. Roll credits. The thing is, that formula works. It works because Berntha sells it every single time. He's so convincing in the role that even when the character is retracing familiar emotional territory, you're still invested in watching him go through it. But at some point, I started wondering whether Frank Castle is actually moving forward as a character or just running laps around the same emotional track. Because if you zoom out and look at the bigger picture, One Last Kill isn't really asking a new question about Frank. It's asking a familiar one. Can he leave this life behind? And if you followed the character for any length of time, you already know the answer. Of course he can't. He's the Punisher. That's the paradox the character keeps running into. The audience wants Frank Castle, but Frank Castle only really exists because of his pain. The moment he truly heals, settles down, finds peace, or moves on, the story ends. And comic book characters aren't usually allowed to end. So what happens instead? The cycle repeats. Frank suffers. Frank questions himself. Frank tries to stop. Frank gets pulled back in. Frank becomes the Punisher again. You can almost feel the special wrestling with that reality. In some ways, it actually becomes part of the viewing experience. You're watching a man who's trapped in a cycle, while also watching a franchise that's trapped in a cycle. And honestly, I think that's why reactions to this special are all over the place. Some people will watch this and think, yes, this is exactly what I wanted. Give me Frank Castle. Give me violence. Give me Jon Berntha doing what he does best. And I completely understand that perspective. But other viewers are going to finish the special and ask a different question. Where do we go from here? Not after this story, after all of them. Because eventually you start wanting some kind of progression. Not necessarily a happy ending. Frank Castle isn't exactly built for happy endings. But maybe a new angle, a new stage in his life. Some sign that the character is evolving rather than restarting. That's where I found myself by the end. I wasn't frustrated with what the special gave me. I was frustrated by how good parts of it were. Because there are moments here where it feels like the story is on the verge of pushing Frank somewhere genuinely new. Like it's preparing to challenge him in a different way. And then, almost instinctively, it circles back toward familiar ground. The strange part is that this criticism exists alongside one of the movie's biggest strengths. Seeing Frank fully embrace the Punisher again is undeniably satisfying. It just is. The action hits harder because of it. The emotional payoff lands because of it. Berntha makes those moments feel earned. But at the same time, there's this tiny voice in the back of your head wondering if we're watching a man rediscover himself, or simply return to the only version of himself the story knows how to write. And that's what makes this section of the movie so interesting to talk about. Not because it fails, because it raises a question that doesn't have an easy answer. How many times can Frank Castle become the Punisher before becoming? The Punisher stops feeling like character growth and starts feeling like routine. I don't know if One Last Kill fully answers that. I'm not even sure it's trying to, but it definitely made me think about it. Honestly, after watching all the discussion around this special, there seems to be one thing almost everybody agrees on, whether they loved the project or hated it. Jon Berntha is not the problem. If anything, he's the reason this thing works as often as it does. And what's funny is that we're so used to saying that now, it almost sounds like a cliche. Every time Berntha comes back as Frank Castle, people immediately start saying he's the perfect Punisher. At this point, that's practically become the default opinion. But watching One Last Kill, I was reminded why people keep saying it. It's not because he's the biggest guy. It's not because he looks intimidating standing in a hallway holding a rifle. Lots of actors can do that. It's the little stuff. The moments where absolutely nothing is happening. There are scenes in this special where Frank barely says a word, yet Berntha somehow makes them feel heavier than entire conversations in other movies. Sometimes it's just a glance. Sometimes it's the way he carries himself through a room. Sometimes it feels like he's physically dragging years of trauma behind him. You never get the sense that he's performing sadness. You get the sense that Frank is exhausted, and there's a difference. A lot of actors can play angry, especially in action movies. Anger is easy. Raise your voice, tighten your jaw, punch a wall. What Berntha does well is everything underneath the anger, the frustration, the grief, the numbness, that strange feeling of somebody who's been carrying pain for so long that it almost feels routine now. That's where I think his version of Frank separates itself from a lot of other comic book characters. Even when he's standing completely still, you feel like something is going on internally. There's always this tension underneath the surface. Like he's one bad moment away from either breaking down or breaking somebody's face. Possibly both. And that's what makes the character feel human. Because, let's be honest, if you describe the Punisher on paper, he sounds ridiculous. A heavily armed vigilante who wages a one-man war against criminals for years and somehow survives impossible situations. That character shouldn't feel real. Yet Berntha somehow finds a way to ground him. He doesn't play Frank like a comic book icon. He plays him like a wounded veteran who never figured out how to put his life back together. That's a much harder thing to pull off. And what impressed me here is how much of that comes through before the action even starts. The action scenes are great. We'll get to those. But some of my favorite moments from Bernthal happen long before anybody throws a punch. Just watching him sit with his thoughts, watching him stare into space, watching him move through scenes like a guy who's carrying around memories he'd rather not revisit but can't escape. Those moments could have easily felt melodramatic in the hands of the wrong actor. They don't here, and then when the violence finally arrives, you get the other side of the performance. That's where Bernthal really becomes terrifying. Not because he's invincible. Actually, one of the reasons the fights work is that he never feels invincible. He feels desperate. Everything looks painful. Every hit feels personal. Every outburst feels like years of frustration boiling over. There's a rawness to it that fits this version of the character perfectly. You never feel like you're watching some polished action hero deliver cool one-liners before taking down 20 enemies. Frank looks tired when he fights. He looks angry, he looks damaged, and somehow that makes him even more dangerous. The interesting thing is that One Last Kill asks Bernthal to carry a lot of the project by himself. More than usual, honestly. The story is relatively simple. The supporting cast comes and goes. The action doesn't really start dominating the screen until later. For a large chunk of the runtime, it's basically Bernthal holding your attention. And he does. Whether you think the story works or not, whether you wanted more substance or more action or a longer runtime, it's hard to deny how much of the special rests on his shoulders. The reason viewers stay invested through the slower sections is because they believe him. They believe this man is hurting. They believe he's lost. And they believe that once the violence starts, he's capable of doing every horrifying thing the movie is about to show you. That's not easy to pull off. A lot of actors can sell one side of Frank Castle. Bernthal sells all of it. The rage, the grief, the guilt, the exhaustion, the brutality. And after all these years, that's probably the biggest reason audiences keep showing up whenever Marvel puts this character back on screen. At a certain point, you're not just watching The Punisher anymore. You're watching Jon Bernthal's Punisher. And for a lot of people, those have become the same thing. One thing I found interesting about One Last Kill is that even though this is very much Frank Castle's story, the supporting characters actually have a bigger job than they might seem at first. Because let's be honest, when you build a Punisher story around a guy who's spending most of his time isolated, grieving, and occasionally turning entire groups of criminals into cautionary tales, the people around him become incredibly important. They're the ones who remind you there's still a world outside of Frank's head. Some of them get more time than others. Some barely show up. But a few leave a surprisingly strong impression considering how short this special actually is. Let's start with Minucci because she's really the engine that keeps the entire plot moving. I thought Judith Light brought an interesting energy to the role. What I liked most wasn't that she came across as some larger-than-life crime boss. Honestly, she feels much more personal than that. Her motivation is simple. She hates Frank Castle. And unlike a lot of comic book villains who spend half their screen time explaining complicated master plans, her anger feels direct, immediate. You understand exactly why she's doing what she's doing. Now, whether the special gives her enough material is another conversation. Because if there's one criticism I kept coming back to, it's that Minucci almost feels more important in theory than she does in execution. The story builds her up as this major force looming over everything, but she spends a lot of the runtime operating from a distance. There were definitely moments where I found myself wanting more. More interaction, more development, just more opportunities to see her personality beyond the role she plays in the plot. It's one of those situations where the character is interesting enough that you wish the movie had another 20 minutes to explore her properly. Then there's Curtis, and honestly, every time Curtis shows up in a Punisher story, I immediately relax a little. Not because he's going to save the day, because he represents something Frank desperately needs but rarely accepts, a connection to normal life. Curtis has always been one of the few people who can talk to Frank without sounding naive or judgmental. He understands where Frank comes from. He understands the damage. He understands the trauma. But he also represents the road Frank never took. The possibility of surviving without becoming consumed by revenge. That's what makes his scenes matter. Even when his screen time is limited, his presence adds weight to the emotional side of the story. He serves as a reminder that there are still people trying to reach Frank, even if Frank doesn't always know how to reach back. And then you have the smaller characters scattered throughout the special, the innocent people caught in the middle, the residents of the neighborhood, the child at the center of some of the emotional moments. None of them are given massive arcs, but they don't really need them. Their purpose is different. They humanize the world around Frank. Without them, the story risks becoming nothing more than an endless stream of targets and bullets. These characters remind you that there are actual lives affected by everything happening around them. And weirdly enough, some of the most effective moments in the special come from those quieter interactions. Not the fights, not the shootouts, just brief moments where Frank is forced to engage with people who aren't criminals and aren't enemies. People who see something in him that he probably stopped seeing in himself a long time ago. That's where some of the emotional texture comes from. Now, I wouldn't say One Last Killix is a special that's driven by its supporting cast. That's not really what it's trying to be. The spotlight remains firmly on Frank Castle from beginning to end. But I do think the supporting players perform an important balancing act. They give the story perspective. They give Frank something to react to besides violence. And, perhaps most importantly, they prevent the entire thing from becoming emotionally one note. Because as compelling as Frank Castle is, spending 50 straight minutes inside his head without anyone pushing back, challenging him, or reminding him of the world outside his pain would probably be exhausting. The supporting characters may not dominate the screen, but they help carry the emotional load in ways that are easy to overlook. And in a story this focused on one man, that's actually a pretty important job. What I think separates The Punisher from a lot of other comic book characters is that his stories usually aren't really about winning. That sounds strange when you're talking about a guy who spends half the movie turning criminals into furniture, but hear me out. Most superhero stories eventually arrive at some version of hope. The hero learns something, the city is saved, the villain loses. Maybe things aren't perfect, but there's usually a sense that something improved. Frank Castle stories don't really operate that way, and One Last Kill understands that better than I expected. Because underneath all the action, this special keeps returning to the same uncomfortable question: what happens when revenge actually works? Seriously, think about it for a second. A lot of revenge stories end right before the interesting part. The hero gets justice, the bad guy dies, credits roll. We never really have to sit with what comes next. Frank Castle is a character who has been living in that what comes next phase for years. That's the tragedy. The people responsible for destroying his family are gone. The mission that consumed his life has already been completed. Yet somehow he's still carrying the same pain. Maybe not exactly the same pain, but close enough. And I think that's why this special spends so much time focusing on Frank's state of mind before the action kicks into gear. It's trying to show that violence solved one problem while creating several others. The revenge happened. The healing never did. That's a pretty bleak idea when you really think about it. What's interesting is that the movie never tries to pretend violence is healthy. It never presents Frank's lifestyle as some aspirational fantasy. Sure, the action is exciting. Of course it is. The fight scenes are designed to get your blood pumping. But the story itself feels far less interested in celebrating violence than people might assume. Every time Frank gets dragged back into conflict, it feels less like a victory and more like an inevitability. Like watching somebody fall back into an old habit they know is bad for them but can't seem to escape. And that's where I found the movie surprisingly thoughtful. Not subtle, necessarily, but thoughtful. Because it recognizes something that a lot of Punisher stories have struggled with over the years. There's always this tension between the audience enjoying what Frank does and the reality of what Frank has become. Those are two very different things. As viewers, we're cheering when the worst people imaginable get what's coming to them. Meanwhile, Frank himself seems trapped inside a life that gets smaller every year. The body count grows. The purpose doesn't. That's a distinction the special keeps quietly returning to. And honestly, some of my favorite moments come from that contradiction. You have these incredibly brutal action sequences that feel cathartic in the moment. Then afterward, the movie reminds you that none of this is actually fixing anything. The violence solves immediate problems. It doesn't solve Frank. If anything, that's what makes the character so fascinating after all these years. He's not Batman, he's not Spider-Man, he's not fighting crime because he believes tomorrow can be better. Frank fights because he genuinely doesn't know how to stop. That's a completely different kind of hero, or anti-hero, or maybe neither, and the movie seems aware of how messy that distinction is. There were a few points where I caught myself wondering how we're supposed to view Frank in this story. Are we supposed to admire him, feel sorry for him, be horrified by him? The answer honestly feels like all three, sometimes in the same scene, and I actually like that. I like that the movie doesn't simplify him into a symbol. It doesn't turn him into a speech about justice or morality. It just presents him as somebody who's been carrying grief for so long that violence has become the language he understands best. That's not noble, it's not healthy, but it's human, at least in a damaged, complicated sort of way. By the end of the special, I wasn't really thinking about how many people Frank had taken down. I wasn't even thinking about the action scenes anymore. I kept thinking about that central idea, the possibility that revenge can become a prison, that you can dedicate your entire life to punishment and still wake up one day feeling completely lost. And for a character like Frank Castle, that might be the most brutal consequence of all. Not the people he's killed, not the enemies he's made. The fact that after everything he's done, he's still searching for something violence was never capable of giving him in the first place. There was something else I kept thinking about while watching One Last Kill, and honestly, it's not even entirely this special's fault. It's more of a Punisher problem in general. Or maybe a Punisher challenge. Because the longer Frank Castle is on screen by himself, the more I start realizing how much this character benefits from having somebody around who disagrees with him. Not somebody he can punch, somebody who can challenge him. And if you've watched enough Punisher stories, you probably know exactly who immediately comes to mind. Daredevil. Now, this isn't me saying Frank can't carry his own story. Clearly he can. Jon Berntha is more than capable of holding your attention for an entire special. We've already talked about that. But there is something fascinating that happens whenever Frank has somebody pushing back against his worldview, somebody asking questions he doesn't want to answer, somebody forcing him to justify what he's doing. That's when the character becomes really interesting. Because left alone, Frank's logic is actually pretty simple. Bad people do bad things. Frank stops them, usually permanently. End of discussion. The problem is that when nobody challenges that mindset, the conversation can only go so far. And I found myself feeling that a few times throughout One Last Kill, not because the story is shallow, not because Frank isn't compelling, but because there's nobody there to really test him. Nobody representing an alternative path. Nobody standing in front of him asking, what happens after this? That's part of what made those old conversations between Frank and Matt Murdock so memorable. They weren't arguing about tactics, they were arguing about morality, about justice, about whether a man can kill his way towards something resembling peace. Neither side ever fully won those debates, which is exactly why they worked. You could understand both perspectives, you could disagree with both perspectives, and the tension between them made the characters stronger. Here, Frank spends most of the special surrounded by enemies, victims, or people who already understand him. There's very little friction, very little philosophical resistance. And as a result, the story becomes much more focused on Frank's internal struggle than on any external challenge to his beliefs. Now, to be clear, that's not necessarily a flaw. In fact, I think One Last Kill deliberately chooses that approach. This isn't a story about whether Frank is right or wrong. It's a story about whether Frank can survive being Frank. That's a different conversation entirely. Still, there were moments where I found myself missing that other layer. Because one of the most uncomfortable things about the Punisher as a character is that he makes sense, at least at first. Everybody understands the appeal of seeing terrible people face consequences. Everybody understands anger. Everybody understands revenge. The interesting part comes when somebody starts questioning where that road actually leads. That's usually when Frank becomes more than just an action character. He becomes a dilemma. And I think that's why so many people immediately bring up Daredevil whenever Punisher projects come out. It's not because Daredevil makes the action better. It's because he makes the conversations better. He forces Frank's worldview into the spotlight. Without that kind of counterweight, there's a risk that the Punisher simply becomes what casual audiences often assume he is, a guy with guns solving problems. But Frank has always been more complicated than that, at least when he's written well. The best Punisher stories aren't really about criminals getting punished. They're about whether Frank Castle himself can still be saved. And sometimes, you need another character in the room to ask that question out loud. One Last Kill mostly chooses not to do that. Instead, it turns inward. It focuses on Frank's relationship with his own guilt, his own grief, and his own identity. There's absolutely value in that. I just couldn't shake the feeling that a character this morally complicated becomes even more compelling when somebody is standing across from him, looking him in the eye, and refusing to let him off the hook. Because the moment somebody challenges Frank Castle, the story stops being about what he's doing. It starts becoming about why he's doing it, and that's usually where the most interesting conversations begin. One of the more interesting debates around One Last Kill is whether its simplicity is actually one of its strengths or one of its biggest weaknesses. And honestly, I can see both sides, because if you strip everything down to its most basic form, this is not a complicated story at all. There aren't 10 different subplots competing for attention. There isn't some giant conspiracy hiding in the background waiting for a third-act reveal. Nobody spends 20 minutes explaining multiverse rules. Nobody discovers a secret artifact. Nobody gets a shocking betrayal from a character you forgot existed. The movie is surprisingly direct. Frank is broken. People are coming after him. Eventually, Frank starts fighting back. That's pretty much the story. And I don't necessarily mean that as criticism. In fact, part of me found it refreshing. We've gotten so used to franchise storytelling constantly trying to set up the next thing that sometimes a straightforward premise almost feels unusual now. There were several points during the special where I kept waiting for some huge twist to appear. Some revelation that would suddenly expand the scope of everything. It never really happens. The movie stays focused on exactly what it introduced at the beginning. There's actually something kind of confident about that. The story knows what it wants to be and doesn't spend much time pretending it's something bigger. At the same time, though, I completely understand why some viewers walked away wanting more. Because simplicity only works when the emotional weight underneath it is strong enough to carry the entire experience. And that's where reactions start to split. If you're fully invested in Frank's psychological journey, the simple structure becomes an advantage. It keeps the spotlight exactly where it needs to be. Nothing distracts from the character. Nothing pulls attention away from the central conflict. But if that emotional side doesn't completely connect with you, suddenly the story can start feeling a little thin. You begin noticing how little actually changes from scene to scene. You begin noticing how much of the narrative relies on atmosphere, performance, and anticipation rather than major plot developments. And again, that's not automatically a bad thing. Some of my favorite films are incredibly simple. The question isn't whether a story is simple. The question is whether it gives you enough to think about while that simple story unfolds. For me, One Last Kill mostly succeeds because it understands what people are showing up for. This isn't trying to be a sprawling crime epic. It's not trying to reinvent Frank Castle. It's not trying to tell the definitive Punisher story. It's taking one specific moment in this character's life and focusing almost entirely on that. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes it isn't. There were definitely moments where I found myself wishing the movie dug a little deeper into certain characters or certain ideas. There are story threads that feel like they could have supported another 30 or 40 minutes without breaking a sweat. You can almost see the larger version of this project hiding underneath the one we got. A longer movie, maybe even a season, something with more room to breathe. But then there were other moments where I appreciated how lean everything felt. The movie doesn't wander. It doesn't spend 15 minutes setting up side stories that never matter. It doesn't constantly stop to remind you that it's part of a larger universe. It picks a lane and stays there. Whether that's satisfying probably depends on what you wanted going in. If you were expecting a massive new chapter that completely changes Frank Castle's future, this might feel smaller than anticipated. If you were expecting a focused character piece that eventually explodes into brutal action, the simplicity actually works in its favor. Personally, I think the truth is somewhere in the middle. The simplicity helps the movie stay focused. It also limits how much impact the story can ultimately have. That's why so many reactions to this special feel contradictory. People finish it saying, "I liked it, but I wanted more." And honestly, I think that sentence perfectly summarizes the narrative itself. There's enough story here to keep you engaged. There's enough character work to make it meaningful. But there's also this lingering feeling that if the movie had just a little more room to operate, it could have become something much bigger than a well-executed slice of Frank Castle's life. As it stands, the simplicity is both the movie's greatest advantage and its biggest limitation. And strangely enough, I think the film knows that. Alright, let's talk about the thing most people are probably here for, the violence. Because no matter how much time the special spends exploring Frank's mental state, no matter how much attention it gives to grief, trauma, or identity, eventually, there comes a point where One Last Kill remembers exactly what kind of character it's dealing with. And when that switch flips, it flips hard. What's funny is that the action doesn't arrive immediately. The movie actually makes you wait for it. Some viewers are going to appreciate that patience. Others are probably checking the runtime every few minutes, wondering when Frank is finally going to start breaking bones. Then it happens, and for a while, the special basically turns into a siege movie. The setup is simple. Frank is trapped inside an increasingly hostile environment while waves of people keep coming after him. That's not exactly revolutionary storytelling, but it's effective because it gives the action a sense of momentum. Every fight pushes into the next one. Every encounter feels like it's creating another problem rather than solving the last one. There's always somebody else coming. Another hallway, another room, another group that thinks they're going to be the ones who finally take him down. They're usually wrong. What I liked most is that the action feels appropriately ugly, and I mean that as a compliment. A lot of modern action movies are obsessed with making violence look cool. Everybody is perfectly choreographed, nobody seems tired, nobody misses, nobody gets hit unless it looks stylish. That's not really what's happening here. Frank doesn't move like somebody performing an action sequence. He moves like somebody trying to survive one. There's a difference. Every punch looks like it hurts. Every fall looks painful. Every gunshot feels abrupt and nasty. Even when Frank is clearly dominating a situation, the movie rarely presents it as effortless. You can feel the wear and tear building up, and honestly, that's one of the reasons the action remains engaging for as long as it does. The special understands that brutality and excitement aren't necessarily the same thing. Brutality is easy. Anybody can throw blood on a wall. The trick is making violence feel consequential, making it feel like every encounter costs something. For the most part, One Last Kill gets that right. The other thing that stood out to me is how varied the combat stays despite the relatively simple premise. Because on paper, Frank fights a bunch of bad guys in a building, doesn't sound like enough material to sustain an extended action sequence. Yet somehow it mostly works. Part of that comes down to pacing. Part of it comes down to geography. The movie constantly changes the environment around Frank, forcing him to adapt. Sometimes he's armed, sometimes he's improvising, sometimes he's using whatever happens to be nearby. It creates this constant feeling that the situation could spiral in any direction, which is exactly what you want from a Punisher story. Now, does every action scene reach the level of the films people inevitably compare it to? Not quite. And that's probably where expectations become important. If you're walking into this expecting the Raj or John Wick levels of action innovation, you might leave slightly disappointed. Those films built their entire identity around action choreography. This special isn't trying to do that. The action here exists primarily as an extension of Frank's character. It's less concerned with showing off and more concerned with putting you inside his headspace. The violence isn't elegant, it's relentless, and that's an important distinction. Because what makes these sequences memorable isn't necessarily how creative every kill is. It's the feeling behind them. You get the sense that Frank isn't fighting because he enjoys it. He isn't delivering some action hero power fantasy. He's doing what he always does when the world backs him into a corner. He's enduring. That's why the action feels different from a lot of traditional superhero projects. There are no triumphant speeches, no crowd-pleasing superhero poses, no moments designed to remind you how awesome the hero is. Instead, you're watching a damaged man bulldoze his way through increasingly desperate situations because violence is the one skill he's never lost. And whether that's inspiring or depressing is kind of up to the viewer, probably both, if I'm being honest. By the time the special reaches its final stretch, the body count has piled up, the brutality has escalated, and Frank is operating at full Punisher capacity. It's exactly the version of the character many fans wanted to see: raw, uncompromising, completely unleashed. The interesting thing is that after all the bloodshed, what stayed with me wasn't any individual kill or action beat. It was the feeling of exhaustion underneath all of it. Because the movie never lets you forget that for Frank Castle, this isn't a victory lap, this is just another day at work. And somehow, that makes all the violence hit even harder. One thing that became impossible to ignore while reading reactions to One Last Kill is just how often people compared it to other action movies. And honestly, I understand why. The second the special settles into its main conflict, certain influences become pretty obvious. The comparison that comes up the most is The Rage. Not because the action is identical, but because the structure feels familiar. You've got a heavily armed and highly motivated protagonist trapped in a hostile environment, while enemies keep pouring in from every direction. As the walls close in, the violence escalates. The further Frank pushes forward, the messier everything becomes. It's easy to see why people made that connection. The funny thing is that those comparisons are both a compliment and a problem. Because The Raid is one of the greatest action films ever made, the second you mention it, expectations immediately shoot through the roof. Suddenly, people aren't asking whether the action is good. They're asking whether it's as good as The Rage. That's a much harder question. Then you've got the John Wick comparisons, which I think come from a slightly different place. With they're talking about momentum, that feeling of one man moving through wave after wave of opponents while the world around him collapses into chaos. At certain points, One Last Kill definitely taps into that energy. The difference is that John Wick often feels mythic. Frank Castle doesn't. Or at least, he shouldn't. John Wick walks into a room and feels like a legend. Frank walks into a room and feels like a problem. Those are very different vibes. That's why I never fully saw the comparison beyond the surface level. And then there's SD Dread, which honestly might be one of the more accurate reference points. The contained setting, the siege structure, the feeling of being trapped inside a dangerous environment while increasingly desperate enemies keep showing up. There's definitely some shared DNA there. Again, though, One Last Kill isn't really trying to become any of those movies. I think that's important to remember, because sometimes comparisons can accidentally create expectations the movie never intended to meet. If you go into this expecting the action choreography of The Raid, the style of John Wick, and the intensity of The Night Comes for Us all rolled into one package, you're probably setting yourself up for disappointment. That's an impossible standard. What I found more interesting is how the special occasionally feels like a video game. And I don't mean that as an insult. Actually, some viewers loved that aspect. The structure almost feels like Frank progressing through levels. New area, new threat, new group of enemies, move forward, repeat. You can practically imagine a health bar appearing in the corner of the screen. For some people, that's part of the fun. For others, it's exactly where the action starts feeling repetitive. Personally, I think it works because the movie never completely loses sight of Frank as a character. If the special was nothing but endless combat encounters, those comparisons would probably become much harsher. But because the violence is tied to Frank's emotional state, it feels slightly different than a pure action showcase. Slightly. Not entirely. The comparisons are still unavoidable. And honestly, they're probably going to follow this special forever. That's what happens when you make a gritty action story in an era dominated by movies like John Wick and The Raid. Audiences naturally start measuring one against the other. The real question isn't whether One Last Kill surpasses those films. It doesn't. Very few action movies do. The more interesting question is whether it successfully borrows from those influences without becoming a copy of them. And for me, the answer is mostly yes. I recognize the inspiration. I saw the fingerprints. But I never felt like the movie completely lost its own identity. At the end of the day, The Raid is about survival. Amish John Wick is about vengeance. Vodestect is about endurance. One Last Kill is ultimately about Frank Castle. The action may remind you of other films, but the emotional core remains rooted in this one damaged guy who keeps finding himself dragged back into the same war. And that's probably the biggest reason these comparisons work at all. Underneath all the bullets, all the broken bones, and all the bloodshed, the movie still feels like a Punisher story first, not somebody else's movie wearing a Punisher costume. More than anything else, I think the thing that surprised me about One Last Kill is how committed it is to its mood. Not its story, not its action, its mood. Because from the opening minutes, this special feels heavy. And I don't mean heavy in the way a lot of modern movies try to convince you they're serious by throwing a gray filter over everything and making everybody whisper. We've all seen that trick before. This feels different. The atmosphere comes from the fact that nobody in this story seems okay. The neighborhood isn't okay. Frank isn't okay. The people around him aren't okay. Even before the first major action sequence, there's this feeling that everything is slowly rotting from the inside out. You can feel it in the streets. You can feel it in the empty spaces. You can feel it in the way characters talk to each other, or sometimes don't talk at all. One thing I noticed pretty quickly is that the special doesn't seem interested in balancing that darkness with much humor. That's become such a standard part of blockbuster filmmaking that when a project refuses to do it, you almost notice the absence. There aren't many moments where the movie stops to wink at the audience. No clever tension-breaking joke, no sarcastic sidekick showing up to lighten the mood. no reminder that we're all supposed to be having fun. And honestly, I think that was the right choice, because Frank Castle has always existed in a very different emotional space than most Marvel characters. The world around him shouldn't feel fun, it shouldn't feel adventurous, it should feel uncomfortable. At times, One Last Kill almost borders on depressing, not in a bad way, just in an honest one. This is a story about a man who has spent years destroying himself in slow motion. It would feel strange if the atmosphere didn't reflect that. What's interesting is that the darkness never feels exaggerated. The special doesn't come across like it's desperately trying to prove how edgy it is. That's a trap a lot of mature comic book adaptations fall into. They mistake misery for depth. Here, the mood feels connected to the character. Everything seems filtered through Frank's perspective. The world looks exhausted because Frank is exhausted. The streets feel empty because Frank feels empty. The atmosphere becomes an extension of his state of mind, and I think that's why it works. There were moments where the special actually reminded me of those older street-level Marvel stories that weren't trying to save the world every 5 minutes. Stories where the stakes felt personal instead of cosmic. You aren't worried about universes collapsing. You're worried about people surviving the night. That's a very different type of tension, and honestly, I miss it. A lot. Maybe that's part of why this special resonated with so many viewers. Even people who had issues with the story or pacing often seem to respond positively to the overall feeling of it. Because whether you love the narrative or not, the atmosphere is incredibly consistent. The movie knows exactly what emotional wavelength it's operating on. It never suddenly transforms into a different genre. It never feels like two competing visions stitched together. From beginning to end, it remains grounded in grief, violence, exhaustion, and isolation. Those are not exactly cheerful ingredients, but they're appropriate ones. And then there's the brutality. Not just the action itself, but the way the movie treats violence. A lot of superhero projects still present combat as something clean and exciting. Here, violence feels messy. It feels ugly. Sometimes it feels disturbing. That's an important distinction. The movie isn't interested in turning Frank into some polished action icon. It wants you to sit with the consequences of the world he's living in. Even when the action becomes thrilling, there's still this lingering sense of sadness hanging over everything. Almost like the movie is reminding you that none of this is normal, none of this is healthy, none of this is something to celebrate. And that emotional weight stays present all the way through. By the time the credits rolled, what I remembered most wasn't a specific fight scene or a particular line of dialogue. It was the feeling, that constant sense of living inside a world where hope feels distant, peace feels temporary, and everybody seems one bad day away from disaster. It's not an atmosphere that will work for everyone. Some viewers are going to find it too bleak, too grim, too relentless. But for a Punisher story, honestly, I can't think of many compliments bigger than that. Because if Frank Castle's world starts feeling comfortable, then something has probably gone wrong. One Last Kill never lets you get comfortable, and whether that's a strength or a weakness will depend entirely on the kind of Punisher story you want. For me, it felt exactly like the kind of world this character belongs in. Something I found myself thinking about after the credits rolled was how much of this special succeeds because the people making it seem to understand exactly what kind of story they're telling. That sounds obvious, but it's actually rarer than it should be. We've all seen projects where the writing wants one thing, the directing wants something else, and the studio clearly wants a third thing entirely. The result usually feels confused, like nobody involved was reading the same script. One Last Kill never really has that problem. Whether you end up loving it or not, it feels focused. The creative team clearly decided early on that this wasn't going to be a giant MCU event. It wasn't going to reinvent Frank Castle. It wasn't trying to become some sprawling crime saga squeezed into 50 minutes. It's a relatively small story centered on one damaged guy having a very bad week. Everything else grows out from there. And I think the direction deserves a lot of credit for maintaining that focus. One thing I noticed throughout the special is how often the camera chooses to stay close to Frank. Not literally every scene, obviously, but emotionally. Even when chaos starts erupting around him, the movie rarely loses sight of the fact that we're experiencing this world through his perspective. That's important because a lesser version of this project could have easily become just another action showcase. Instead, even during the quieter moments, the directing keeps pulling our attention back toward Frank's mental state. The way scenes linger, the way certain moments are allowed to breathe, the way the movie occasionally pauses just long enough for you to sit with what he's feeling. Some viewers are going to call that slow. Others are going to call it character work. Honestly, both descriptions are probably fair. Then, there's the screenplay. And this is where reactions become a little more complicated, because I think the writing does some things really well. The emotional side of Frank feels authentic, his grief feels authentic, his exhaustion feels authentic. They were trying to explore what years of violence have actually done to this man. That's worthwhile, at least in my opinion. But then there were other moments where I started wondering if the story was circling ideas we'd already explored before. Frank is struggling. Frank is grieving. Frank is questioning his purpose. Frank gets pulled back into violence. If you've followed this version of the character for a while, those themes aren't exactly new. They're familiar, and familiarity isn't necessarily a problem. Some characters are built around recurring struggles. Batman wrestles with the same demons. Wolverine wrestles with the same demons. Frank Castle certainly does. The challenge is finding a way to make those struggles feel fresh. Sometimes One Last Kill succeeds. Sometimes it feels like it's revisiting old conversations. And that's where the question of necessity starts becoming complicated. Because I don't think this special exists solely to move Frank's story forward. I think part of its purpose is simply re-establishing him, reminding audiences why they care about him, reminding Marvel why audiences care about him, maybe even reminding Frank himself who he is. There's value in that, especially after years away. But it also creates a strange viewing experience where the project occasionally feels caught between being a story and being a statement. A story asks, what happens next? A statement says, this character still matters. One Last Kill sometimes feels like it's trying to do both at once, and honestly, I don't think that's entirely a bad thing. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that some of my favorite scenes aren't really concerned with advancing a larger plot. They're concerned with deepening our understanding of Frank. That's a different kind of storytelling, a smaller one, more intimate. The problem is that audiences often judge franchise projects based on progression. We expect movement, we expect evolution, we expect the next chapter to significantly change what came before. This special doesn't always operate that way. Sometimes it feels content simply spending time with the character. For some viewers, that'll be enough. For others, it won't. And I completely understand both reactions. Because if you're looking at the special purely from a plot perspective, you can make a reasonable argument that Frank ends the story in a position that's not dramatically different from where he started. But if you're looking at it emotionally, the experience feels different. You spend time inside his grief, his anger, his exhaustion, his loneliness. The movie deepens those ideas even if it doesn't radically transform them. Maybe that's why I keep coming back to the word justification rather than necessity, because I don't think every story needs to reinvent a character. Sometimes a story earns its place simply by helping us understand that character better. The real question is whether One Last Kill does that successfully. For me, the answer is mostly yes. Not because it reveals some shocking new side of Frank Castle. Not because it changes the mythology. Not because it launches 10 future projects. Because it spends time examining the cost of being Frank Castle. And that's something worth exploring. Still, I can't completely dismiss the opposing perspective. I understand why some viewers finished the special and thought, okay, but what was the point? That's a fair question. The movie doesn't always provide an easy answer. What it does provide is a reminder. A reminder of why this version of the character continues to resonate. A reminder of why Berntha remains so effective in the role. And a reminder that beneath all the violence, Frank Castle is still one of Marvel's most tragic characters. Whether that's enough to justify an entire special presentation will probably depend on the viewer. But I think that's ultimately why this conversation exists at all. People aren't debating whether the character deserves to return. Most people already know the answer to that. They're debating whether this particular chapter gave him a reason to, and that's a much more interesting discussion. So after sitting with One Last Kill for a while, thinking about what worked, what didn't, and why the reactions have been so all over the place, I think I've landed on something fairly simple. This is one of those projects that's easier to appreciate than it is to fully love. And I don't mean that as criticism. I actually mean it as a compliment. Because there are plenty of movies and shows that are technically bigger, louder, more ambitious, and somehow leave less of an impression once they're over. This isn't one of those. The strange thing about One Last Kill is that its strengths are immediately obvious. Jon Berntha is fantastic. Honestly, at this point that almost feels redundant to say. We've spent years talking about how good he is as Frank Castle, but performances like this are the reason that conversation never really goes away. He carries the entire project, not just the action scenes, the quiet scenes, the uncomfortable scenes, the moments where nothing explodes and nobody gets punched. Those are often the scenes that matter most. Beyond that, I think the atmosphere works. The special understands the world Frank Castle belongs in. It understands the weight, the loneliness, the ugliness. It never tries to sand down the edges or make the character feel safer than he should. For a Punisher story, that's important. The action works too. Maybe not in a revolutionary way. Maybe not in a way that's going to permanently change the action genre, but it works. It's brutal, physical, and appropriately nasty. More importantly, it feels connected to Frank's character rather than existing purely as spectacle. That's a big reason the violence lands as often as it does. At the same time, most of the criticisms people have aren't exactly wrong either. The story is familiar. Sometimes, very familiar. There are stretches where it feels like Frank is revisiting emotional territory we've explored before. The narrative occasionally feels more interested in reminding us who Frank Castle is than showing us who he's becoming. And depending on your expectations, that can either feel comforting or frustrating. Maybe both. The runtime doesn't help that conversation. There are characters who could have used more development, ideas that could have gone further, conflicts that feel like they're missing one final layer. You can sense the larger version of this story that exists somewhere beneath the surface. Whether that larger version would have actually been better is impossible to know, but you can definitely feel its absence. That's probably why the special creates such an unusual reaction. I don't think many people are going to walk away from it feeling disappointed. I also don't think many people are going to walk away feeling completely satisfied. Instead, most viewers will probably land somewhere in the middle. Enjoyment mixed with curiosity, appreciation mixed with frustration, admiration mixed with the feeling that there was still more left to explore. And honestly, that's where I landed too. Because when I think back on One Last Kill, I don't remember a project that failed. I remember a project that almost feels like a conversation about who Frank Castle is now, a conversation about whether violence can ever give him peace, a conversation about whether this character can move forward without losing the qualities that made people care about him in the first place. The special doesn't provide definitive answers to any of those questions, but maybe that's part of why it stays with you. The best moments aren't the ones that resolve something. They're the ones that make you keep thinking afterward. And despite all my criticisms, despite the narrative limitations, despite occasionally wishing the story pushed itself further, I kept thinking about it. That's usually a good sign. At the end of the day, One Last Kill succeeds because it understands the most important thing about Frank Castle. The violence isn't the story. The guns aren't the story. The body count isn't the story. Frank is. Everything else exists around that. Sometimes the special loses focus. Sometimes it doesn't go far enough. Sometimes it feels like the beginning of something larger rather than a complete destination on its own. But when it keeps its attention on Frank Castle, the broken man underneath the skull, that's when it becomes genuinely compelling. And maybe that's the best way to sum it up. One Last Kill isn't the definitive Punisher story. It isn't the bold reinvention some viewers might have wanted. It isn't perfect. What it is, however, is a reminder. A reminder of why this character still matters. A reminder of why Jon Berntha continues to own this role. And perhaps most importantly, a reminder that beneath all the violence, Frank Castle remains one of the saddest figures in Marvel's entire universe. For some viewers, that will be enough. For others, it won't. But either way, I don't think you'll forget him once the credits start rolling. And honestly, that's probably the strongest compliment I can give it.